House of Ashes is the latest in the Dark Picture Anthology, but with their horror inspirations worn on their sleeve, we asked Will Doyle, the game director, in a dream world what horror movies he would love to make a game from next. From Nightmare on Elm Street to Day of the Dead and even Aliens, here's what he had to say about Supermassive's dream horror collaborations.
We've looked at so many different genres. For making these games, we have a set of pillars that we try and, fit our gameplay around. So we always have to have a really, really terrible threat. In Little Hope, we were sort of inspired by the movie It Follows, where you have this kind of curse and this sort of supernatural creature chasing after you. In House of Ashes, it's definitely sort of inspired by Aliens, where you have this horrible kind of implacable threat, this big monster. The really interesting thing about the Aliens franchise is the creature itself is so inhuman. There's nothing that you can connect to. It's completely sort of seemingly emotionless. It hasn't got any eyes, there's no real face that you can look at. It has kind of mouths within mouths. It's a real monster. Therefore, there's very little you can kind of connect to it. It's just an implacable threat. And that was something we were very interested in with House of Ashes. We really wanted this kind of thing that's only interested in killing you. It can't be reasoned with. It's difficult to stop. And that's really interesting because I think that one of the great things about horror in general, one of the purposes of horror is to allow us to project ourselves into different situations, to kind of think, what would I do in that situation? And being hunted is a very visceral thing. One movie that I've always liked myself that I'd love us to look into is A Nightmare on Elm Street. There's this sort of like classic sort of 80s slasher monsters, a supernatural being that's chasing after us. Nightmare on Elm Street has always been interesting because it has the kind of group of characters all affected by the same thing and all connected by this sort of shared history. It has a really, really horrible monster in the form of Freddy Krueger chasing after you, and also the shifting nature of going from reality to dream and being unsure of that kind of mix back and forth. That really, really fits a video game well. There's a load of horror video games which you'll play where, they do fun tricks, like you open a door and then you're back in a different part of the game. I'm in Elm Street, opening that door and ending up back in Freddy's boiler room, you can kind of see how it would be done. So the wonderful thing about the Dark Pictures Anthology is it allows us to explore all these different types of things. So, we could go from something like that to something much more kind of, visceral and gore-based. Day of the Dead was always one for me as a kid that jumped out. Grew up in Japan, and I remember in Japan they don't have ratings for video game for movies, or they didn't back then. One of the video stores on my way back from school played Day of the Dead, like in the window of the video store, and I just stopped walking back from school and started watching it. And there's scenes where people get their entrails ripped out and get completely torn to pieces. So yeah, zombie movies have always been, for me personally, that's something I really like. So yeah, there's loads of them. Day of the Dead to Wreck, and obviously the more modern zombie films now are putting spins on it. So in researching the whole anthology, we were obviously looking into supernatural folklore around the world. When you start to research demons, you kind of circle around to Mesopotamia and to the Middle East, because there's just such a rich history. It goes back thousands upon thousands of years. The mythology and the cosmos, in the way people thought of life and death back then, was really, really, really different. It was very interesting for us that when we started looking down that avenue, we discovered this really, really cool story, a historical story of this king who wages war on the gods and destroys this temple and curses his own kingdom and brings about famine and ruin and demons on his land. Reading that, it's like, oh, that's straight out of a horror film. It sounds perfect. So that gave us the kind of inspiration. And it's also got connections with other horror films. Like there's a demon god called Pazuzu who shows up in the Exorcist movies and features heavily in our temple as well. The novella At the Mountains of Madness was a big influence for us. In that story, it's set in Antarctica, but it's a group of people going off on this kind of mission, but discovering something underneath the mountains. I'm a big H.P. Lovecraft fan, and there's so many things. Obviously, he's famous for the short story, you know, and that ties in really, really well with our anthology. And there are a number of, you know, stories that he wrote that are kind of like ahead of their time, like, you know, The Colour Out of Space very much described what would happen with sort of radiation poisoning. There are many, many influences of Lovecraft, but then Lovecraft influenced so many movies as well, you know, so there's so many other things we can just look at. We're always considering our options. As a studio, storytelling is kind of at the heart of all the games we like to make. Something that resonates with many people, tells a good story, is always going to be of interest to us.
For everything on the Dark Pictures Anthology and the upcoming House of Ashes, you're already in the right place with IGN.